Summer days are winding down, and we're glad you're here. Welcome to another edition of Moral Side of the News. I'm John Blim with the WHAS Crusade for Children. With me, as always, is another distinguished panel this week. Reverend Sally McClain, Christian Church Disciples of Christ.
John?
Reverend Dr. Kilen Gray, Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. Rabbi Stan Miles, Louisville Melton School. And Father Bill Hammer, St. Margaret Mary and St. William Catholic Churches. We begin today with another layer of loss in eastern Kentucky. As a result of extensive flood damage, some schools will be unable to open this fall. The indefinite postponement could mean students miss out on an entire school year. Meantime, Kentucky lawmakers are in a flood relief targeted special session. Governor Andy Beshear said he is, quote, pushing FEMA harder than they've ever been pushed before, and that more is needed to aid the Appalachian counties where at least 39 people were killed. So turning to our panel on Moral Side of the News, what can be done to help? What more can be done?
First of all, it's really gratifying that this is all taking place and in a reasonably timely manner. I think that my own opinion is what is happening now is helpful. But what has to happen is to help those people in that area. They want to live there. It has to be made possible so they can live there safely, and that they're not going to just rebuild their houses, rebuild their schools, rebuild their businesses, only to have this happen again and again and again.
And specifically, even say towards the topic of schools themselves, there have been, in some ways, some lessons learned by our experience of going through COVID. In that, there's no question, last fall, and again, we're still experiencing it, our parish sponsors of school, kids are behind where we normally would receive them at, especially the real younger ones. Both in their social skills, some of them, and in even just some of the preschool kind of work that normally happen. And so to be very intentional about setting up processes to help them catch up. Regrettably, I would suspect that, again, things like laptops are not going to be available. Wi-Fi is still probably, an issue, so that, in the past, you could still gather, if you didn't have a school. We did that, during COVID. We weren't in school, but we still gathered to try to learn. But again, something as simple as a laptop are not available. Having homes, that have access to Wi-Fi. A lot of that stuff has also been a struggle, I would think, in Eastern Kentucky long before now. But to be able to set up some centers that would invite kids to come together would be another avenue to consider as an alternative. But if the school's wiped out, or if the school's being used as a shelter, those are things that it is important to provide first, those kind of needs. But education for children is a primary need.
What I'm understanding that we're doing is with structural things, with material things, buildings, education, etc., which is not a structural thing, but education is important. I'm not knowing or hearing that we're dealing with the emotional issues of what these people are trying to deal with. For example, when I was in junior high, our house burned. It was nothing like this. I mean, we were out of our house for almost a year. And I remember the stress, and nobody was killed, but we had nothing left essentially. And then we had to rebuild the house, or the rest of the house. And so I'm thinking of the emotional trauma that these children and families have been with. If they've lost loved ones, they've lost everything. So yeah, we can get them back in and we can educate them, but what are we doing for them emotionally and maybe even spiritually? How is that happening? Have we reached out to our congregations to find out, what their need is? I'm just asking these questions because I believe truly that they are important.
I definitely agree with that assessment. As a mental health professional myself, many times the disaster response neglects the mental and emotional care of people, and that is also an economic issue because, there has to be payment systems set up for persons to be able to receive the care that needs to be received therapeutically. And many times there are people that can't afford that. And so it's important that as the state responds to disasters, that mental health and emotional health becomes just as much a priority with the recovery. And yes, that's a longer term motion that needs to happen, but it's important. It cannot be neglected. That's why I agree with Sally on that.
And to find, as I was saying, ways to get these kids and families together, just being able to share space. But again, the toll that takes when you're also isolated, especially at that kind of age. We've always talked about, and education is the total education. It's not just intellectual education, but, even just getting to play sports together. I mean, that's actually life skills, cooperation, playing on a team, doing your best, sometimes having to sacrifice for the good of the team. I mean, all those kind of life lessons, the values, getting some balls, to get some kids together to play, again, get parents together, so to find some safe places that people can come together and also then access a lot of these other services that we've been talking about that's part of the total care for these children and their families.
I know in Mayfield, the situation of the tornado, we in Kentucky think that we will have tornadoes. We know that we're not immune to that. We also know that we're not immune to flooding. But to have this kind of devastation, to have a whole town wiped out, to have several counties pretty much wiped out, we've not really dealt with that recently, probably within the last, 22 decades or so. So to have this kind of devastation is something that our insurance companies are having to deal with. And really, we're all, having to deal with on some level.
The fact that it's over such a long time, in many ways, Mayfield and Western Kentucky has been on our back burner. What we have to realize is our recovery efforts, particularly with regard to children, transcend those natural events going back to the pandemic. We have to develop a plan that starts with the pandemic to help these kids get where they need to get socially and intellectually. And to do that, we have to realize that whatever we plan isn't going to be a quick fix. It's going to be ongoing for years and years and years. And for children, the elementary school children, this is going to have to track them and help them all the way through high school.
Oh, I don't think high school, I think for the rest of their lives, especially if they've lost family members. We talk about Mayfield, but we don't talk about Bowling Green. And in Bowling Green, beyond my son's apartment, there were 2 Bosnian families completely wiped out, completely gone. We don't talk about that. Imagine that Bosnian community and how they're trying to recover after that incident. And so there are things that we simply don't talk about. It's not in the news. It doesn't make money. It's how we spend money. No, this is grief. This is tragedy. This is sorrow. How do we deal with this?
The other issue of my prayer, rather, is hopefully that the legislators will also keep in mind equity in their response to the disaster, because with each disaster that happens, we have historical record that there are certain populations, there are certain aspects of neighborhoods, there are certain zip codes, there are certain
Correct.
realities that tends to get neglected or tends to receive the short shrift on assistance and help. And so it is my hope and my prayer that there's somebody in the governor's office, within the Senate or the House chambers of the state, that's raising the alarm to make sure that we start with what we have historically neglected before, so that we can make sure that we include, and it's not going to be enough. You can never do enough. And even if they legislate this week by Friday, which is the deadline of when they're supposed to have this completed. So I'm hoping that they're able to be successful in not having any neglected populations.
A component of this, I was going to say, we have all of us, and including me first as well, all of us and the legislature as well, are very much focused and should be on the immediate needs. We've already alluded to long-term needs, impact on children, all throughout the rest of their school careers, throughout the rest of their life. But I hope we also don't lose track of what could potentially be, with some confidence, contributing factors. Things like, again, things that now mean groundwater runs off much more quickly because there's not enough stuff on the ground on these mountains to catch it. Trees, deforestation, some of the impacts of some of the other things that we have done to the environment, even things that, again, contributing to some of the things like, even if it's denied, climate change, even if it's just saying this is just what happens. I think there is human contribution to some of what's happening, and we need to be attentive to that as well. Again, God's creation, God's gift to us. That's not the discussion for this moment, because we have to take care of these kids, these families in this moment for the long term of that. And again, there's been a number of things implying that why so much water hit these areas and not absorbed on the hillsides.
Okay, panel, we're off to a good start on this edition of Moral Side of the News. We'll move on to our second topic now. The Russian invasion of Ukraine just passed the 6-month mark. Ukraine President Zelensky said this week, during these 6 months, we changed history, changed the world, and changed ourselves. And the whole world learned who Ukrainians are and what Ukraine is. No one will say this anymore. It's somewhere over there near Russia. End of quote. So turning to our panel, experts predict this war could drag on for a long time. Let's hear your thoughts at the 6-month mark.
I just hope that 6 months out, that the Ukrainians are able to hold on and that the world will not forget them. Since this began, I've been thinking a great deal about the United Nations. When the United Nations was founded in the midst of World War II, one of the primary reasons was so that something like this would never happen again. So my question is, how did all of the nations of the world allow this to happen again?
I don't have an answer to that, Stan. I don't know. I don't know how effective the United Nations is globally. But what I do believe strongly is that we have come to see how cherished democracy is, how fragile it can be, how it can be taken advantage of by an overpowering enemy, and that can other countries unite to keep that fragile democracy in place. We do not realize how privileged we are many times in the United States to be able to argue back and forth our politics, to be able to say back and forth what we want to say, to be able to complain the way we want to complain. And we take for granted so often the preciousness of what we have.
I think that at the 6-month awareness of this invasion of another nation by a larger, much larger nation, one of the things that we need to take away from this is the difference that leadership makes. If we would have had a different president in the office, including in particular, the one that just left the office, this entire response of the world and our nation would be totally different. Because we remember that the previous president was working hard to pull America away from its global engagement to make sure that the response that is happening now to put at bay what would have been a war that would have been over before 6 months. It would have been completely over. But because of the deterrence that has been led by President Biden and joining with other nations to ensure to return America's place in global negotiations and global actions to make sure that we operate in the vision of the United Nations and NATO and others, we would be having a different conversation right now about Ukraine. And so leadership makes a difference. It makes a significant difference. And I just have to give kudos to our current administration for rallying other nations and other leaders to talk with the European leaders to be able to come together to make a stand against this aggression. This would be a totally different 6 month. It wouldn't even be 6 months. The previous president regarding the Ukraine.
Similarly, I think it's also gotten this long or gotten to this point because again, so many mixed messaging, and I think that's part of what Kilen's been alluding to as well, mixed messages, where there are significant numbers of Americans who support Russia in this whole process, been very public in the support of Russia, and significant, much more significant, I believe, who have condemned it and challenged it. And so the mixed messaging, but also I think globally, there is recognized so much more interdependence. And so you kind of want to pull back. Well, if we boycott this or that, then what impact is that going to have on our gas price? What's that going to have on our grain prices? So people are juggling their own pocketbook against sometimes standing up for what may be a greater issue, freedom. That as long as I got my freedom and I got my needs being met at minimum cost, then they have to figure it out themselves. But another thing that has come to my mind is, again, thinking of our own efforts for freedom as a nation. And again, how much more insignificant numbers, poorly equipped by comparison, were able to commit themselves and withstand. Now, I also pull back from that wonderful analogy of our American Revolution, standing up, to the big major power of the time, the British. They didn't have airplanes in those days. They didn't have, the ability to launch missiles and launch, things from a great distance. So in other words, if Britain had some of the same resources that Russia has today, to be able to, to put it right down, and who knows how our own story might have gone. But I think our story should inspire the Ukrainians and should inspire us to support the Ukrainians, that even though they may be a smaller nation, smaller in terms of the access to resources, but right and justice and goodness, ultimately, and that's a faith state, will triumph. As across all faiths, traditions. Sometimes there is evil that temporarily wins out. But ultimately, we believe justice and God will side with the oppressed. God will side ultimately. And that's where also I keep it in my prayers as well.
I think Ukraine has been such an example, as we've heard, of leadership and also of wanting to keep the union intact. And in talking about what's going on in our own country and the misinformation Um, I, this is really not a part of this discussion, perhaps, but I had a friend say to me just last week, because we are politically pretty much opposite, and she was saying, well, perhaps this will come to civil war in our country. And I'm thinking, you don't know what you're saying. You have no idea what you're saying. And so to see this country united in a battle for themselves, to hold on to what they have, when we're willing to say we want to fight it out, I have a hard time with that.
All right, panel, we're moving right along on moral side of the news. We've got a little less than 5 minutes left, so I want to jump ahead to one topic toward the end. Trailblazer Bessie Coleman was honored this week. Who's Bessie Coleman? In 1921, she became the first Black woman to earn a pilot's license. In a tip of the hat to Bessie Coleman, American Airlines sent an all-Black female crew into the friendly skies this week, operating a flight from Dallas to Phoenix. So our panel on moral side of the news, Black women represent less than 1% of pilots in the commercial airline industry. Your thoughts on this flight this week of an all-Black female crew?
Congratulations. That sounds amazing.
I pray for the day when this will not be remarkable at all.
Mm-hmm.
That
absolutely
a person's skin color will not determine what they can or cannot do, where they can go or live or work or enjoy themselves. That skin color will be totally and completely irrelevant.
And gender, Stan. Can I add gender to that?
Of course.
Let's add gender.
Well, I want to definitely congratulate the effort of American Airlines for having this flight, the symbolic flight. It means everything, especially to the African-American community. It means everything, and for African-American women in this country. And I join your sentiment of one day hoping that we can have a different conversation. But it takes fight and it takes work, and it takes us all committed to realizing that vision, putting our hand to the plow and addressing directly those continued systemic vestiges that persist within, that keeps white supremacy where it is within our nation. And so I think these are the type of symbolic steps that are very important. Symbolism is everything. Visuals are everything. It helps to turn the tide, but we must work together to not be afraid to confront those forces that continue to mitigate against seeing the vision that Stan, you so eloquently put forth.
And so those forces are still at play in large parts of our society, and that needs to be acknowledged. And yet, whenever there's a first, whatever it may be, first person who steps on the moon, the first person, African-American, who's president of the United States, their first person who's now vice president of the United States, the very first person who does anything, even in a small little business, or the first person in a school, whatever it may be. Trailblazer invites people to follow behind. And hopefully more and more people step up and continue to follow behind and walk along with, not just following behind, but walking along with. And then when they're have that experience, then take the leadership. And so that's what I think I look forward to, out of this. Again, there was a trailblazer. I know in your promo, John, you said in the 1920s. I think it was the 1920s. There was a trailblazer back then who has not been forgotten. And I hope, what happened with American Airlines flight will not be forgotten. And so many other things that we need to make sure we don't forget, to keep remembering and keep acknowledging, yes, this is the first, but this is the first of many more steps. And that's what I look forward to as well.
Yeah, can I add to that? The first female doctor, the first female professor, the first female clergy, the first female rabbi. Can I add that to the mix?
Well, it's definitely a powerful image to see when you see African-American females who have been pretty much the bottom rung of the economic structure of our country for years. For them to be flying a plane that symbolizes their ability for leadership in aeronautics and in other efforts, that visual is just, it's $1 million. It's beyond anything that you can't underscore how important that visual is. So again, I congratulate American Airlines for that effort.
I congratulate American Airlines, but to me, there's an element of sadness here. There's the celebration of the first female African-American pilot 100 years ago, but throughout her aviation career, sadly, I doubt if she would have ever at all been in the cockpit of a commercial airliner. And that's the tragedy.
All right, panel, thank you for your discussion today. Yes, Trailblazer Bessie Coleman Bill, that was in 1921 when she earned her pilot's license. Thank you, Sally McClain, Kilen Gray, Stan Miles, and Bill Hammer for your participation on Moral Side of the News this week. If you'd like to catch this program again, just jump on YouTube and watch any episode from the past year and just search for Moral Side of the News. And Moral Side is now a podcast. Just search for it wherever you get your podcast. So thank you, panel. Until next week, thanks for your time. We'll see you then.
You got out of bed. And see what happens. Hold it still here and, oh!
So this is the Dreams with Wings camp. We have 2 camps. One that serves individuals with Down syndrome and another that serves people on the autism spectrum.
Now, how many people here have actually seen the Ohio River?
Anybody?
I work at Louisville Water, and my job at Louisville Water is the best.
We had the Louisville Water Company and Tyler McCrae, a very talented instructor, teach us about filtration and the importance that plays in keeping us healthy and in the water that we drink.
That is the name of the filter that we use. Is it coming out faster than the sponges or a little slower? There we go.
Yeah,
and then now I'm gonna pour. Ready? Here we go.
Good job, everybody. Good job.
Let's see what happens.
This is our 21st year, so we're really excited to be able to keep bringing it back and delivering a summer to remember every single time. Dreams with Wings is so many things. We are a local nonprofit that serves children, teens, and young adults from ages 7 to 87.
Oh, our 3 closest scientists have all said yes for the sponge.
It's really everything we can possibly do to spark creativity, physical activity, and social emotional learning.
Heather, are we ready for me to turn back around? Okay.
Are you guys ready?
Yeah!
All right, here we go. Ready? Let me see. Oh, yes.
We're extremely grateful because we wouldn't be able to do it without the crusade. Without the generous gifts of all the donors and without the crusade, we wouldn't be able to make this camp everything that it needs to be and that these campers deserve to have every single summer.